If you'll take your Bibles, we're going to go back to Daniel chapter 7. Head back to Daniel chapter 7. We started this last week. We'll try to wrap it up this week. Finish out some questions that Daniel has about this vision. Hopefully you heard about some jobs that you're grateful you don't have. And see, the ultimate goal is to make you feel better about the job that you do have. Like I said, unless that happens to be the one that came up. It's like, oh yeah, what I'm doing right now. So, Daniel chapter 7. Let's start with a little bit of just a recap, because we are picking up kind of halfway through this. If you remember last week, Daniel was given this vision. And it had a lot in common with the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had seen back in chapter 2, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Well, this time it's Daniel. He has this vision of these creatures. And as it was explained to him later, as he asked for an interpretation of that, the one that's explaining it to him tells him that this was representative of a succession of kingdoms. That, again, just like back in Daniel chapter 2, there were these series of kingdoms represented by the different kinds of metal on the statue. Well, this is kind of the same progression, but now represented by creatures. The succession of kingdoms culminating in God's kingdom being established on the earth. So if you remember the vision that Daniel had, these four very unusual creatures that you, even without the explanation, you probably would have assumed there was some kind of symbolism going on in this, because these are not normal. It's not like he was just, visiting the zoo and he happened to see some animals there. These are some strange animals. He had that winged lion. And that probably wasn't a hard one for him to figure out, because remember we said the winged lion was a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon anyway. And so that connection, that this first creature that come on was a picture or a representation of the Babylonian Empire, that was pretty straightforward. But then, just like in the statue, it would eventually be replaced. Well, that second beast eventually gave way to a second beast that came up out of the sea, and that was this raised up bear. It was raised up on one side as if one side was stronger than the other. It had these 3 ribs in its mouth, and it was continuing to conquer even beyond that. And we saw some of the symbolism in that the Medes and the Persians, that empire that came after Babylon, that conquered Babylon, one was always stronger than the other. The Medes went for a period of time where they were the stronger kingdom, and the Persians then kind of took dominance later. That kind of made sense with that symbolism of the raised up bear. The 3 ribs in its mouth, there were 3 major kingdoms that the Medo-Persians had conquered. And so maybe that seemed to be that symbolism there. But again, that kingdom would eventually give way to another kingdom. He described the third beast as this leopard with wings on its back and 4 heads, and just describing this really bizarre kind of conglomeration of animals. Well, if we're following the progression, Babylon was replaced by Medo-Persians. Well, what conquered the Medo-Persians? Well, it was the Greek Empire. So a leopard with wings on it's not a bad representation. That's a pretty fast animal to begin with, and now it's got wings. It's even faster, kind of representing the speed of the Grecian Empire. But the 4 heads there kind of turned into some interesting symbolism because of what happened to the Greek Empire. After Alexander died, his empire got divided up into 4 different areas. His 4 generals kind of took over a quadrant of the empire each. So you had an empire now with 4 heads on it, kind of picture. So some very interesting symbolism. And then the last beast was this beast that Daniel doesn't even really give a description of. He said it was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. It was just this hideous beast with all these horns on it, and then we'll get into some of the additional things where it had this little horn that came out and started doing great things. And then the last image that Daniel saw was the Ancient of Days, this majestic figure sitting on the throne, and there was this person, the Son of Man, that was standing before him, and he was given the right to rule and to reign, and he judged all of these other kingdoms, and they were done away with, but this Son of Man's kingdom was established, and unlike these other kingdoms that eventually faded off the scene and were conquered, this one lasts forever. And so we got to the end of that, and Daniel's looking at this thinking, oh, wow, what does all this mean? I mean, this is a bad dream to wake up from. This is a lot of scary imagery for him to see. And we're going to see in the second half of the chapter, there were even some things that haven't been mentioned yet that were probably especially troubling to Daniel about this particular vision. And this second statement that we looked at from last week is really going to come into focus in the second half of the chapter. That while it's going to be encouraging that, God's kingdom, the Son of Man's kingdom, the permanent kingdom, the glorious kingdom is going to be established eventually, what Daniel is realizing is that there's going to be some time. I mean, he's really, when he gets this vision, he's still in that Babylonian stage. I mean, if he's hoping that, the kingdom's going to come tomorrow, well, he's realizing now that there's going to be some time that passes. There's going to be a series of events that has to go through. And we'll see some troubling violence and some opposition and some time that has to play. And so the vision that he's had so far has kind of given him this overview. He's kind of seen through God's revelation the course of human history all the way up to where it's going to end. But he still has some questions. And so that's really where we're going to pick it up in verse 19. Verse 19, as he's seen this, he wants to know more about what all of this is, what's going on. So let's look down at verse 19. He says, "Then I would know the truth of the fourth beast." I have more questions about that one in particular. He had already had explained to him that these were successions of empires, but I really want to know more about that one, which was diverse from all the others. Exceeding dreadful, whose teeth were of iron, his nails of brass, which devoured, break in pieces, stomp the residue with his feet. I mean, Daniel's particularly interested in this fourth beast. It's ferocious. He gives these descriptions of this creature that are very graphic. It's violent. It's awful. It's a destructive monstrosity. And probably the parts that he calls attention to in verse 19 are the parts that really disturb him. These iron teeth, these brass claws. This is really troubling for him. But that's not the only thing he has questions about. Verse 20. "And the 10 horns that were on his head." Okay, what? I get their symbolism, Daniel says. I get this is symbolic, but what do those 10 horns mean? What's the symbolism there? "And of the other which came up, before whom 3 fell." Remember, one of these, there was 10 horns, but then another horn, it says, comes up, and it takes out 3 of the previous horns, and he described this horn as having eyes and a mouth that spake great things. Daniel's like, okay, I'm really going to need some more information about that. That's just, I understand that's probably important. That's not an insignificant detail. So what's up with that little horn? He wants to know about that one. Verse 21, he gives us some more information about this little horn. Not only did it have eyes and a mouth speaking great things and was more stout, it was bigger than the others. He said, "I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints and prevailed against them." We hadn't been told that previously, that was part of the vision, but apparently it's something that Daniel saw, that this little horn, when it comes to power, one of the things that it does is it goes after God's people. And seemingly has a lot of success in doing so. I mean, it literally says he prevailed against them. He's winning. He's persecuting God's people and doing a good job of it. Verse 22, "Until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was given to the saints of the Most High, and the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom." The image that Daniel sees is this little horn that goes after the people of God and seems like it's going to defeat them, and the only reason he doesn't is because the Son of Man's kingdom stops him from doing so. So you kind of already understand Daniel being a little nervous about this. Like, what is it? What does all this mean? I want some more information about that. I want to know more of what's going on. Who is this little horn, and why is he persecuting God's people, and what should we do about it? That seems to be particularly what's, to say, bothering Daniel, is this previously unrecorded detail. Remember, his context for the saints of God that the little horn is making war with. I mean, Daniel takes that personally. That's his people. That's the Jewish nation. That's who he would credit as being the saints of God, God's people, God's chosen nation. So, God, you're telling me that there's coming this super great persecution, this somebody who's going to come in this future, this little horn that's going to terrifically and terribly and awfully persecute the Jews? I get that there's ultimate victory. I get that he's not going to ultimately succeed, but wow, God, why are you going to let this happen? Why is this taking place? I think you can imagine why Daniel is specifically concerned about this. The fourth kingdom that it's connected to, the little horn, the persecution. How is all this going to play out? Well, verse 23, he starts to get his explanation. Thus he said, remember, this is doesn't really identify who the one. It was somebody that Daniel had been asking questions of. We can kind of assume this is probably an angel. Daniel has other passages where angels show up to interpret visions for him. Someone, though, with divine perspective is explaining this to Daniel. And he said, the fourth beast shall be the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which shall be diverse from all kingdoms, shall devour the whole earth, and shall tread it down and break it in pieces. And the 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall arise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and he shall subdue 3 kings. So again, he's interpreting the symbolism here. We've seen the image. Now, what is that representative of? What do these images tell us? Well, he says that fourth kingdom, or the fourth beast, he says, is the fourth kingdom upon the earth. Now, if we go back and we remember, the progression, this is our benefit, that we have hindsight. Hindsight's 20/20. We can look back and recognize this is all future for Daniel. He's still living in the Babylonian Empire. He doesn't have a name for these future empires that are coming, but we can look back and we can identify them. The Babylonian Empire, the first great world empire there, and then replaced by the Medes and the Persians, replaced by the Greeks, and we know who replaced the Greeks. That was the Roman Empire. So for us, identifying the fourth kingdom as Rome it's not that tricky. We can make those connections. The order of the beast, corresponds very well with world history, and even the description of how he describes this fourth beast matches very well. Those of you who didn't do like I did and sleep through world history class, you remember that's a good description of Rome, just devastating and dominating and doing so in a manner unlike any kingdom had ever done before. Nobody did what Rome had done to the extent that Rome had done it, and with the influence that Rome had. Rome is truly a diverse beast, as Daniel would call him here. So he says that fourth beast is the fourth kingdom upon the earth. It is different from all the others. It does devour the whole earth. I mean, Rome, for all intents and purposes, conquered all of the known world. There wasn't much left that was worth having by the time Rome was done with it. And so that's a good description of them. And so this picture here, it also corresponds, remember, with the last kingdom, or the kingdom progression in Daniel 2. We had the head of gold, Babylon, the arms and chest of silver, the Medes and Persians, the belly and thigh of brass, the Greeks, and then the legs of iron. Well, that following the same progression here, the fourth kingdom there was Rome, the fourth kingdom here is Rome. So I think those are running parallel. So what about these 10 horns, though, in verse 24? Well, let me just remind you go back to what we've looked at previously. Think back in your minds to Daniel chapter 2. Those legs of iron, what comes after the legs? Well, you actually have feet at the bottom of the statue. The statue didn't end with legs. It ended with feet. And it said the feet were iron and clay. There were some connections, obviously, literally in a statue. The feet are connected to the legs. But even in the material, there was some relationship there. It was feet of iron, just like legs of iron. But it was mixed. It was weakened to some extent. It was spread out a little bit. It was mixed with clay. There was some kind of kingdom that came after the fourth kingdom that was similar in many ways, connected to, related to, but had some uniquenesses, had some differences. And I'm not trying to overplay the symbolism here, but your feet have how many toes? 10 toes. So that's built into kind of the imagery here. The feet have 10 parts to them. So really what we're seeing here is still parallel to that dream in Daniel chapter 2. That here he sees the head of this beast has 10 horns, and so they're connected obviously to this fourth beast. The head is connected to the rest of the body, but it's got some uniquenesses to it, just like the statue in Daniel chapter 2 did. So let's keep playing off of this. In verse 24, he says, the 10 horns derived from this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise. So whatever he's describing with these 10 horns, it's 10 kings, he says, that are coming out of this, connected to it. Now, he doesn't describe much about what their relationship to each other is. He doesn't say, are these 10 kings in succession, one to another, like there's a first king and then a second king and then a third king? That's kind of how we tend to think about royalty, right? If you think of a royal family, you tend to think of successions. But remember, that's not the only way to think about this. These 10 horns do all appear at one time. These 10 horns, he mentions them as a group. So this could be 10 kings that are kind of in an alliance with each other, like 10 kings of different places who are kind of working together. So sometimes you'll hear us use the words a confederation of kings. That thought is not uncommon to us. We're used to countries working together for common goals. Ever since World War II, we've had a United Nations. You can debate whether or not they're effective or not, but that's kind of the theory there, is nations that cooperate, work together. You'll have other nations that'll make treaties with each other and agree to cooperate and work together. So I think that's probably a better picture of what's happening here. I don't think this is 10 kings one after the other. And I think it's a group. It also makes sense that it's not a linear thing, because we're going to see the little horn in just a moment displacing 3 of them. That kind of implies that they're all simultaneous, not in succession. So he's describing a situation here where you have these 10 kings, these 10 kingdoms idea, that are working together, that are somehow connected to that 4th beast, the Roman Empire. Remember, this is also if we're running parallel to the statue, and even in this vision, this is kind of the last one. If this has been a succession of kingdoms, if we've seen Rome and then Medo-Persia and then Greece and then Rome, or Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, this group of 10 kings is at the end. They're the ones that specifically we're going to see are going to get judged. If you're looking at the 10 toes on the feet of the statue in Daniel, that's where the rock hits that crumbles the statue. That's the last group, the last kingdom that's around whenever God's kingdom is established. So if we're looking at broad chronology, this is describing the kingdom at the end, the kingdom right before Messiah's kingdom is established. So I wanted to say all that before I showed you number 2, so that it kind of makes sense when you see it. If the 4th beast is Rome, then the 10 horns on the head of the beast, they're connected to Rome. I call it Romanish. I don't know if that's a word or not, so grammarians don't get mad at me. They're Romanish, they're Roman-like, but there's distinct. There's something different about them. In this Daniel 2 statue, it was iron mixed with clay. It's kind of a weakened form, not nearly to the stature of what the previous one was, but similar in a lot of ways. And this is also the one that is going to be ultimately replaced by God's kingdom upon the earth. Well, obviously that hasn't happened yet. So we're talking here now a future perspective. We can look back at those first 4 kingdoms and say, oh yeah, those 4 are past. But now we're looking at one that hasn't happened yet. It's not in play yet, because when it comes on the scene, it's ultimately replaced with God's kingdom on the earth, and we know we're not there. So we're kind of looking at a little bit of a future, and we're kind of in between, if you will, those images. Now, just to kind of throw this out to you, say, well, you're reading a lot into this, that this is a 10-nation confederacy of kings or whatever. It says it's part of the beast, so how is this not Rome? Well, keep in mind, that's not without precedent even in this vision. What did we see in the 3rd beast, the one that pictured the Grecian Empire? It conquered with great speed, but it had 4 heads. Well, that didn't happen simultaneously with the Greek Empire. Alexander conquered everything. It was a unified empire, and then later it was divided. When it got to the heads, it was divided into multiple parts. I think we're seeing kind of a similar thing here, that there was Rome, and then at some point, something similar to Rome is going to arise with these 10 leaders, these 10 heads, if you will. So the image here seems to be illustrating the end times government. Same situation that was described with the iron and the clay in Daniel chapter 2. Now, as soon as you say that, though, that immediately starts raising some of the fun questions. Okay, so the end time government is a 10-nation confederacy that's related to the Roman Empire. What's it going to be? I don't know. I know it's been popular, people who write books about this kind of stuff that like to speculate on end time events. They all got real excited when the European Union came about, because it's in Europe, and it's countries that used to make up part of the Roman Empire, and they were all confederating together, and we're like, ooh, is this it? Well, I don't know. I mean, I looked it up yesterday, and there's 27 nations in the European Union right now, so you got to at least do something there. There's got to be some consolidation somewhere if the EU is the end time government. I don't know if that's it or not. I just know that what this is saying is the government that's around right before Messiah sets up his kingdom is a 10-nation confederacy that looks like Rome. That's as far as I think we can go with it. So I'm not reading the newspaper to try to figure out what the Bible says. I'm looking at what the Bible says to try to figure out what's in the newspapers, I guess is probably a better way to look at it. But to understand that. But At the very least, I will say this. Just recognizing the possibility of, the former Roman Empire coming back together, the European Union is at least kind of a proof of concept of that it's not unfeasible that these nations would one day work together and cooperate with each other. So, like I said, I'm not saying the EU is the beast or is this, this 10-nation confederacy, but it reminds us that what the Bible is describing is true and literally is going to happen one day. There is going to be this group that forms this government system that in a sense is kind of like a revival of the old Roman Empire in a new form, and that's the group that's being described here. Now the focus, though, ultimately is not so much on the group, it's on what happens to the group. And that's what Daniel wants more information on. He wants more information. I want to know more about that little horn. I want to know about that one that takes out 3 of those countries and kind of assumes control. Tell me about him, because he blasphemes God and he persecutes God's people, and I want more information about him. So let's go back and look back at verse 24 again. What does it say about this little horn? The 10 horns out of this kingdom are 10 kings that shall arise, and another shall rise after them, and he shall be diverse from the first, and shall subdue 3 kings. So if this little horn says he comes after these 10 kings, so the picture here is these 10 kings are in place, this confederation is going, and sometime after that gets going, this little horn comes up after them. If those 10 horns are an end times government, this little horn is someone that eventually assumes position of power over the others. That gives you a brief description of this. Again, we're talking about the future, so it's hard to nail down exactly what happens, but we've seen before in world history, people who get groups together to try to, run things, and one person wants more power than the other, so he manipulates things or takes out individuals or does something to get control of the group. Well, apparently that's what this little horn does. The group gets established, but then he comes up, and it says he takes out 3 of the horns. Is that a military conquering? Does he conquer 3 of the nations? Does he assassinate? I don't know how he does it, but somehow he gets controlling interest in this group. He's going to at least control, a third of it, and apparently that's enough, because it says he is in charge now. He runs this confederation. He's in charge of the operation. He rises to power over this 10-nation league. And so we think, this is curious, because is there anything else in Scripture that describes someone like this? Is there any place else in the Bible that describes an individual who comes to power in the end times and kind of is the singular, world ruler running the show? Well, we do have some information about that in other passages of Scripture. The Bible, in many other, and we'll see some of them in the book of Daniel, talks about a person who's coming in the future who's going to kind of lead the world, specifically in rebellion against God and in the persecution of God's people. This is kind of the first time we're introduced to him, so not a lot of information is here, but remember, we're not limited to just this. And I'm not going to go too deep into it because we're going to see much more detail in the weeks ahead as we go through the rest of Daniel. But I think we've made enough connections here to make some conclusions about who this little horn is. There's a name that we commonly refer to this future world leader who leads the world in rebellion against God and the persecution of God's people. We commonly call him the Antichrist. Now let me just preview this for you, give you a heads up on this. We always call him the Antichrist. That word is like never used in Scripture regarding this person. It is a biblical word. It's used in John, talking about people in general who reject the deity of Christ. But the word Antichrist, which is weird that we use it to refer to this person, is not really a biblical reference to this person, but I'm going to use it just because we all know what that is. Here he's called a little horn. If you look at like 2 Thessalonians talks about him, and it calls him the son of perdition, calls him the man of sin. Revelation 13 just simply refers to him as the beast. There's lots of ways the Bible refers to him. I'm still going to use Antichrist because most of us know what that means. We've read enough novels and we've seen enough, Left Behind movies in our youth that we know who the Antichrist is. So I'm just going to use it as a popular term there. But that seems to be who this is describing. Somebody who takes control at the end times, and it's specifically describing some of the actions that he does. So let's focus a little bit of attention on that. Verse 25 tells us about this little horn. It says, he shall speak great words against the Most High. The first thing it does is that it says that he speaks out against God. Our word for that is blasphemy. What he's notable for, his main characteristic, is that he is against God. So in that sense, an antichrist is not a terrible term for him. He is certainly against God. It says specifically he speaks these great words against the Most High. Again, we're going to pull in and connect some other passages that later we'll probably revisit in more detail, but I mentioned 2 Thessalonians. If you go read 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is talking about this future individual, this man of sin who's coming, this son of perdition. And it says specifically one of the things that he does is that he will set himself up in the temple of God and demand that he be worshipped as God. Well, I can't think of anything more blasphemous than that for a person to claim to be God who isn't. A person who claims demands to be worshipped, who's not God. And for people to believe that he's God, he's going to have to obviously denigrate the true God. Don't follow him, follow me instead. Worship me, not him. So blasphemy is something that is characteristic of this individual that we refer to as the Antichrist. Revelation 13 talks about at some point during that time period, during the future, that this Antichrist is going to set up a statue, an image of himself, and demand that people worship it. And if they don't worship him and worship his image, that he's going to, you can't buy food and you can't conduct business, and he's going to force people to worship him. Again, that's a good statement of blasphemy. That's putting himself in a place of God. That's exactly what this passage says he does. He speaks great words against the Most High. His second characteristic that's described here is that he persecutes the Jews. I love this phrase here. This sounds like a southern colloquialism. He will wear out the saints of the Most High. I don't know if your dad ever told you that. He can wear you out. Well, here specifically, this idea of wearing out is the idea of oppressing, persecuting, seeking to destroy. His goal is to eliminate the people of God, which makes sense. If he's against God, he's going to be against God's people. If he wants to blaspheme God, the group that would be most aligned with God, he wants to go after them too. And so persecution of God's people, the saints of God here. And remember, in the context of Daniel, and we're not in a church age yet, the only context for the people of God here is the Jewish nation. And to be honest, Daniel's kind of used to that. He's used to seeing his people being persecuted. They've been through a lot already, and will still go through a lot more in the future. But boy, somebody's coming, Daniel finds out now. It's really going to crank up the dial on persecution. I mean, he's targeting God. He's targeting God's people. He seeks to wear them out, to eliminate them, to destroy them. Part of that also is, keep going in the verse, he says, not only shall he speak words against the Most High and wear out the saints of the Most High, and think to change times and laws. I didn't put this one on your handout, but this statement about he wants to change times and laws. Just connect that with what he just said. This is a person who wants to get rid of God. So there's a sense in which changing times and laws is, I'm not going to go with what God has set up. I'm not going to do with what God wants me to do. I want my own system. I want my own control. I'm going to reject anything that's already there. I want to change times and laws. So maybe it's just a reference to his organizing the world under himself. But if you connect it with what he's just done, he's trying to persecute the Jews. He wants to blaspheme God, and he's persecuting the Jews. There is a possibility of what it means here by changing times and laws is part of his persecution of the Jewish people. Remember, they had certain times and seasons that were set up by God. The word here that's used for times can be used for religious holidays. God had a set of laws that he had established for his people, rules that he expected them to conduct by. Well, it could be part of his persecution that changing times and laws is his efforts to, I'm not going to let the Jews practice their religion. They're not going to be able to celebrate their holidays, or the Sabbath, or other religious holidays, or I'm going to change their laws and make the stuff that they want to do illegal and make legal the stuff that they're not allowed to do, kind of stuff. That could be part of his persecution. It is trying to change times and laws. But I want to mention one other thing to you about what this may mean when it says his goal is to change times and laws. I'm not going to have you turn there, but maybe you can jot it down just to look at it sometime. Go back sometime back to Daniel chapter 2. We've already seen a lot of connections to that chapter here, so I don't think this is a bad connection to make. If you go back and look at Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar makes a statement to the wise men at one point. Remember the scenario there where the wise men, they're brought into the king, and the king says, tell me my dream. And they're like, how do we know your dream? We don't know what your dream is. And he's like, no, you tell me what my dream is or I'll have you killed. And they come up with all these statements. They're like, well, but if you could tell us this, or if you could tell us this. And he makes a statement to them. He says, you are simply seeking to change the times. You're trying to wait until the times be changed. He says, you're lying to me. You're stalling, trying to delay the judgment. There's a judgment that I promised you, and you're just trying to make stuff up and do stuff to delay the judgment that's coming. And the word he uses is, you're waiting, you're trying to get the times changed. That's already in Daniel as a kind of the sense of somebody who's trying to delay a judgment that has already been promised by manipulating circumstances. Again, I know Satan's not mentioned in this passage here, but I don't think you've got to stretch to figure out Satan's behind all of this. Can you understand this person who's trying to change times and laws? What has Satan been promised all the way back since Genesis chapter 3, verse 15? You're going down. You're going to be defeated. There's a son of man that is coming who's going to crush your head, and you are going to be defeated. He's already been promised that his destruction is coming. Is it that he's using this person, this little horn, to try to either change or delay that judgment? It kind of makes sense. If you can get rid of the Jews, then God can't keep his promises to the Jews. If you get rid of the people, then the Messiah can't come in. And if they're not available for God to keep his promises to, then God can't do what he said he's going to do. So I think that may be part of this as well when it says he seeks to change the times and laws. Sure, I'm sure as a king he's trying to organize everything under himself. Certainly he's persecuting the Jews. But I wonder if he's ultimately not doing this trying to, under the direction of Satan, trying to keep God's judgment from ultimately falling. Satan's deceived himself into thinking he can win. He's deceived himself into thinking that he can, put one over on God here. And apparently he's trying to use this individual to accomplish just that. Well, we know he's not going to succeed ultimately, though, because of the next verse. It says, or the end of the verse, into verse 25. He shall speak great words against the Most High. He shall wear out the saints of the Most High. He shall think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand. Now don't miss that phrase. Shall be given. It's not something he takes. This is something that God allows to happen. Shall be given into his hand until a time, times, and a dividing of time. Now, if nothing else, take from that whatever time he has to operate is limited. God's already said, this is it. This is as far as you can go. This is as much time as you have. You're not going to change the times. You're not getting out of this. God says, I have a plan and I have a purpose, and that plan and purpose even includes you coming to power. But it's limited. Whatever amount of time this is, God set the boundaries. God's going to determine when it starts. God's going to determine when it ends. This guy who's going to blaspheme, who's going to speak out against, who's going to try his best to stop God. Do you remember the image we saw earlier? All these kingdoms on the earth, and then we changed and it was the Ancient of Days sitting calmly on his throne. Exactly what's going on here. Oh, he's scrambling. Oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to. You picture God just sitting there going, no, you're not. You're not going any farther. You're not going to start until I say you start, and it's going to end when I say end. It's all under my control. This time, times, and dividing of a time. That's all he is given by God to do. Well, let's pause on that and mention, though, because this is going to come up several times. Does this give us any indication of time frame for this? We'll just think about the words there. He says a time, that's one thing. Times, that's multiple things. And then a half of a time, that's half of that thing. So if you take one and then you assume the plural is two, and then you have the half, 1 plus 2 plus a half is 3.5. 3.5 somethings here. Using the idea of times in the sense of years, technically has already been established in Daniel. If you go back to Daniel chapter 4, remember the promise about Nebuchadnezzar when he was going to be out of his gourd? It said until 7 times pass over him. And we saw what that meant. That meant 7 years that he was going to be out. So if times here is years, a time, times, and a half a time, 3.5 years is the time span in which this person is given to operate. He gets to do what he does. He blasphemes God. He persecutes God's people. He tries to change times and laws for a time, times, and half a time, 3.5 years. So I just want to kind of trace you through and see how we got there. Now, later in the book, we're going to get even more detailed information. I mean, we're going to say, well, it doesn't say years, it says times. I know. Later in the book, Daniel's going to tell us how many days this is. And he's going to tell us exactly how many days, and we'll see it works out to 3.5 years. So save that one for when we get to Daniel chapter 12. But for right now, what we're told is this individual is in charge, persecuting God's people, doing all of this stuff for 3.5 years. Let me step aside and say something else, because I know automatically are thinking, because we've heard all our lives, well, the tribulation is 7 years long. Yes. But the Antichrist, this individual being in full control and full power during that time, only seems to happen during the second half of it. I'm not going to say trust me. We're going to get to that later that sees why that plays out that way. But it's not like, the tribulation starts and then the next day the Antichrist just, I'm in power. Now, it seems like there's some transition. There's that 10-nation confederacy. At some point during that, somebody takes control of that and comes to full power. Well, apparently that happens about halfway through. And we'll see that reinforced several times in prophecies to come. But for right now, what he's telling us is that this time of persecution, blasphemy, and power lasts for 3.5 years. How does it end? Well, verse 26, we're reminded again, but the judgment shall sit, and they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it unto the end. And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdom under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High, whose kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. We've already seen it already that at some point the Ancient of Days steps in, judges the little horn, judges that confederacy, and the Son of Man is given permission to set up his kingdom, and he rules and reigns with his people for all of eternity. So at the end of all this, after seeing this little horn doing these terrible things, the explainer here to Daniel is quick to remind him, don't worry, that's not the end. Don't forget, the Ancient of Days is on the throne. The Son of Man is coming to establish his kingdom. And when he establishes his kingdom, those saints of the Most High that you were so concerned about, they will rule and reign with him. And this kingdom, I love the phrase there, the greatness of the kingdom. All of God's promises, everything God has said is going to happen, is still going to take place. We get to the end of this vision, and I don't know what you would have expected verse 28 to say. Look at what 28 does say. Hitherto is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my cogitations much troubled me, and my countenance changed in me, but I kept the matter in my heart. Even after the explanation, Daniel's still troubled, still concerned. He's troubled by his dreams. He's shocked. He says his countenance was changed. Literally, his face has gone pale. Even though he's promised ultimate victory, boy, what he's seen is a lot of upheaval. He hasn't been given the details as to when these things are going to play out. He's promised that many of his people are going to die in the struggle. There's a lot of unpleasantness in this dream, even though he knows how it all ends up. Just kind of summarize the chapter, and then we're going to pull in some lessons from this. You got 4 kingdoms, a confederation of 10 nations, eventually controlled by this blasphemous persecutor who reigns for 3.5 years before he's judged by God, and his kingdom is replaced by God's kingdom on the earth that lasts forever. The big picture of Daniel chapter 7. He is judged when the Son of Man, Messiah, comes. His kingdom is brought to an end. And Daniel has seen all of this future, in a sense, play out. So what do we do with this? Okay, it's a fascinating and sometimes, like Daniel felt, a troubling vision. So what's our takeaways? Let me give you some lessons to take with you from Daniel chapter 7. First of all, I'll remind you this, that prophecies in the Bible are literally true, even when they're revealed in symbolic form. There's a reason why prophecies often have a lot of symbolism to them, because you're having to describe things to people that haven't happened yet. And sometimes you're having to describe things that don't exist yet. So, think about vocabulary and words that don't exist yet. How do you communicate that to somebody in the present? There's not a word for that. So what do you do if you want to make illustrations timeless? If you want to describe something that's in the future, but you want anybody anywhere to understand it? Well, you put it into images. You put it into symbols that can be interpreted at any time. Everybody can understand what a four-headed beast and a raised-up bear, and those are timeless images. And so I don't want you to be thrown when we see prophecies in the Scripture that include a lot of the symbolism. What happens is people say, "Oh, you can't take prophecy literally because do you think there's actually going to be like this hideous beast that crawls up out of the ocean in the future?" It's like, no, I don't believe in Godzilla. But I do believe that God is describing real events. That is a picture of a kingdom coming to power, and that really is going to happen. These things are actually going to take place. Even though he's describing them in symbolic, metaphorical language, he's describing real events that are going to occur in the future. So just remember that in general when you read through prophecies. Can you read the book of the Revelation and interpret it literally? Of course you can. And it doesn't mean that, again, some multi-headed beast is going to slither up out of the ocean one day. It just means he's describing somebody who comes to power, and there's a lot of symbolism in helping understand who this person is and what he's all about. Same thing happened here. There was a real Roman Empire. There was a real Babylon. There was a real Medo-Persia. There were real Greeks, even though he described them using very colorful metaphors. So we can take prophecies literally, even when revealed in symbolic form. A second one that may be a little bit more comforting for us to remember, just in general, is that God's plan is being accomplished in human history. Notice that this was an ordered schedule. There were no surprises on this. God is telling Daniel, I already know what's going to happen. This kingdom will be replaced by this kingdom, will be replaced by this kingdom, will be replaced by this kingdom, who will be led by this person, who will be defeated, and God's kingdom will be established. I mean, God's laying it all out for him. There's no surprises. Everything's happening on time, on script, on schedule. That from their perspective, I can see why Daniel would be very troubled. But we have a benefit now of looking back and seeing, yeah, everything's going exactly as God planned it to do. And that should, for us, give us a little, maybe more comfort even than Daniel had. Daniel's on the front end looking at an uncertain future. We're looking at, well, listen, God hasn't missed a beat yet. And that should give us some confidence going forward as well. God's plan is being accomplished in human history. Third statement, third takeaway, God's sovereign and will rule the earth through the Messiah. Don't miss how God ended it with Daniel. God didn't leave Daniel with, oh yeah, times are going to get tough. Great persecutor, great blasphemer, stinks to be you. That's not what God said. God said there's going to be these terrible things happening. But remember, it ends well. It ends with Messiah and God's kingdom and it never ending. I think sometimes we need that reminder that it does all end well. Daniel's looking at the reign of Belshazzar. Remember, he's in the third year of Belshazzar. He doesn't know what's going to happen to his people. He's been essentially removed from power. He doesn't have any influence over this new kingdom. He's wondering what's going to happen. God reminds him that God's on the throne. Messiah's kingdom is sure and eternal. The court will sit. Christ will reign. The saints will rule. Jesus' future reign is a literal physical existence, and we need to keep that in our perspective. This kingdom is established by God. It's not our job to bring about the kingdom. God's going to take care of that. But we can anticipate, and we can look forward to. We can be faithful while we wait. And that brings me to the fourth lesson I think we should take away from Daniel chapter 7. Knowledge of the future does not eliminate concern for the present. I am somewhat encouraged by the fact that Daniel was troubled by what he knew about the future. Even though he knew the same things we knew, he still recognized that there's some things to be concerned about. There's no lack of faith being concerned about events unfolding in the world around us. We ought to be constantly in prayer and looking for what God's going to do. We don't know what's going to happen between now and the future. We know how the book ends, but we don't know how many chapters are in it. Okay, so we do concern ourselves, and it ought to provoke us to prayer. You watch the evening news, pray about it. And it's not a lack of faith to say, Lord, I'm uncertain about what tomorrow holds. But just always end that with, but I'm certain that you hold tomorrow. And use that to encourage us in the present. As believers, we have hope for the future, but God's given us a window of opportunity to serve now. We're not just sitting around until Jesus comes. We hurt with those around us who hurt. We rejoice with those that rejoice. We serve the Lord while we can. We don't forget that even though what God's going to do in the future is coming, that our job in the meantime is to do right. As we're told in Scripture, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with God. That's what He expects of us today. So, yeah, we know the future, but we live in the present, so let's be faithful today. I just have one announcement before I send you on your merry way this morning, and that is to, I guess, not be concerned about the future. You're going to hear talk, and there will be statements that are made about combined Bible studies next week. That's for the college students, so we will still meet here next week. So sometimes what we hear is combined Bible study. Well, there are a lot of combined Bible studies next week, but you're still welcome to come here, and I hope to see you, and we'll, Lord willing, jump into Daniel chapter 8, start next week. All right, see you then.